Hey Terry, thanks for joining us. Tell us a bit about the summit that you attended recently. What was that for, the event, and who was there?
It was the Global Summit on the societal role of meat, which covered the topics from the perspective of nutrition, so what role does meat play in nutrition? Secondly, from the environment, what role does meat play in the environment? And thirdly, what's the social aspects of meat and how does meat actually fit in society? And if I take the last one first, for hundreds of millions of people globally, owning animals such as cattle is the only asset that they can actually own. So they may never be able to own land, and it's culturally really critical in India and right through Africa. And Africa has 20% of the world's cattle, for example. Absolutely critical, the cultural role. Cattle are bride price, for example, still and a very important part of their culture. From the perspective of the environment, well, it's well known that if we run animals the right way, with good grazing management, then we can heal environments, we can sequester carbon, and we can do all the right stuff. So it's not the animal that's the problem in the environment, it's actually the management of that animal that we have to control, and that's a human issue. In terms of human health, it was really obvious. There was a couple of great experiments that have been done in Africa. One was 10,000 kids, and they were fed one meal of meat a week, and they found that the cognitive ability of those kids lifted by over 40% with just one meal of meat a week. And when they adjusted that data set for the kids that had AIDS, then that meat meal increased cognitive ability by well over 70%. And that's due to the nutritional value of meat. There are many nutrients that are only available in meat. And so it's a really critical part of our diet. I think one of the other interesting aspects was looking at, well, what are the alternatives to meat that are hitting the market? And there's two. There's plant-based fake meat, if you like, and there's cell-based fake meat. And an Australian, Professor Wood, spoke in a lot of depth on the cell-based meat production system. And what he said was that the technology is very sound. It's been around for a long time, so they can certainly produce meat from cells. But it's not scalable. So that technology, because of all sorts of technological constraints, can't be scaled up so that meat becomes a significant part of our diet. And it's also very expensive to do. So his belief is that it may become a very, very small niche market for a very, very high price. The plant-based meats, they may have some small market share going forward, but they suffer really from the nutritional issues associated with not having meat in your diet. So it might be a fake meat, but it doesn't actually contain the nutrients that meat contains. So that going forward is an issue. It was an excellent conference with nearly 200 scientists from all over the world and another 200 online. Some really, really brilliant papers delivered by people from many, many countries and cultures, and it looked at it from lots of perspectives, and there was plenty of robust debate over some issues, and it wasn't just about cattle. We're talking about meat was really, that's cattle, it's pigs, it's chickens, it's fish, it's all forms of meat are involved in that. And the group that put this together has actually been successful in the World Food Forum to get meat recognised as being an important part of the diet, and also an important part of the environment, and also an important part of our culture going forward.
And what do you see as the next steps from here for the conference, its purpose, and what might come of this?
Where it will go to, I think, is that early next year, by March, all the papers that were delivered will be published. And then there's a significant body of science that's been pulled together on all aspects of meat globally. that then can be used to support policy change at government levels. And also what has come out of that was what's called the Dublin Declaration. And the Dublin Declaration is a declaration of the importance of meat in society, in the environment, and also in our nutrition. And that's being signed by senior scientists globally to support the case for meat.
What were your observations of Australia and our place in the meat industry compared to other countries?
I think Australia's generally well advanced and fairly well regarded internationally in terms of the work, the R&D that's done. I found certainly from a policy perspective around carbon, Australia is pretty well ahead of the rest of the world. And a very interesting aspect for me was that when you talk to people from Europe, for example, the total focus there is on reducing emissions. And now they're starting to bring out the stick and starting to punish farmers for methane emissions and nitrogen emissions. And so I think that, but not giving those farmers any opportunity to sequester carbon to offset those emissions. Australia is 180 degrees in the opposite direction. In Australia, what our policy allows us to do, we've been encouraged to sequester carbon, and that is pulling it out of the atmosphere, not just slowing down the rate at which we put it in there, actually taking it out. And Australia is using the carrot. And so we've now got farmers in Australia that are starting to receive, and will in the next year, some really significant checks for sequestering carbon in soils, for example. And that opportunity is not available in Europe. And so Australia is actually, in terms of agriculture, has not focused on the emissions. We've actually focused on the ability to sequester. And it was well recognised at the conference that Australia has massive advantages in that we have a small population and a very large land mass. And that allows us to sequester a lot of carbon relative to the number of animals we have and relative to the number of people that we have. And some of our own data, for example, is showing that we can sequester over 50 kilograms of CO2 into the soil for every kilogram of steak or beef sold off regenerative properties.
And finally, is there anything that you would say is relevant for us to take home and do at home in light of what you've seen and heard at the summit?
Eat meat for sure, and stay healthy by eating meat. There's stuff that you can only get from meat, and that will improve our cognitive ability. And I think it's very obvious in societies where they don't have access to that quality of protein. You have people that are stunted both physically and mentally, and that's that's a pretty ugly thing to have several billion people around the world suffering from protein deficiencies. So let's not have a protein deficiency in Australia. We don't need one. And I think the other thing is that from a farming perspective, recognise that we do have the policies, we have the methodologies, and we have the market for farmers to get into soil carbon sequestration and fund their future, fund succession, fund debt repayment, and fund expansion in their own businesses. And so far, the value of carbon from the Queensland properties that have been measured exceeds the net income from livestock by a factor of about 5.
Thanks for your time and for sharing some information about your visit to Ireland and the summit.
Thank you, Cal.